Let's go to the next speaker then. That's Rishi Nalin Kumar. He's a volunteer chapter data lead at DataKind UK. In his day job, he's the chief scientist at ebench.com. Previously, he's worked with various companies, including Unilever, Spotify, and The Guardian, to help build their data science capabilities and to introduce data into their everyday decision-making. Today, Rishi will explain us what it takes to use data to build a better world.
So we should admire our friend Matthew, who is in the back, who is following everything and managed to do the switch in less than 2 seconds. So.
Well, thank you for that. Wouldn't know how to give Philippe's presentation. Good morning, everybody. I'm Rishi Kumar from DataKind. I'm a chapter lead in the United Kingdom, and I'm very excited to be here at the Data Innovation Summit in Brussels to talk to you about data for good. And thank you to Philippe and the conference organizers, Nicoletta, for organizing and for inviting us to participate. So briefly, for those of you who don't know DataKind, we help data volunteers from around the UK and from around Singapore, Bangalore, San Francisco, Washington, DC, and New York, so chapters all around the world. We help these data volunteers participate in the Data for Good movement. It's a purely volunteer-based organization with the exception of a handful of employees. But what does Data for Good mean really? And to understand Data for Good, I first want to talk a bit about data for business. And so many of us will be familiar with data for business as this art and science of correspondence between proprietary data and high-value commercial problems. But the solutions we develop don't provide the value, at least not on its own. And so as the story goes, it's people, non-data people, that have a job to do. And we can create value as data professionals because using data, science, and technology, we can help them to do this job faster, better, with greater impact and less resource. And that really works. And then they say data is the new oil for our economy, data scientist is the sexiest job in our workforce. And while I don't know if any of that is true, what I do know is that data science is a science of effectiveness, and it's a science of efficiency, and we don't want it to become a science of money generation alone. And so that's what the Data for Good movement is all about. It's about using those same techniques to find that same kind of value, but instead of working on these commercial problems, we're going to work on societal problems. And the Data for Good space is filling up with all these wonderful, interesting people who are very talented and doing very good things. And of course, here's a few organizations, and DataKind would just be one of those organizations. Now, doing Data for Good isn't actually very easy. And even figuring out where to begin is often not very clear. So what I'd like to do today is share with you some of the basic ingredients of a Data for Good project that we figured out over the last 3 years of learning by doing. And the first learning is simply to celebrate all outcomes. Because if this is what the world looks like before your project, it's likely that that's also what the world is going to look like after. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Over the last 3 years, we've had projects where we have had some impact on the world, but we've also clearly had projects which simply didn't. For example, we've had projects where we looked at citizens' advice questions. So we have a citizens' advice bureau, people submit questions to them, and so we looked at the text data from these questions to try and identify what are the new emerging areas and categories of concern. And we ended up building this prototype dashboard, and the dashboard identified the rise in concern, for example, with zero-hour contracts. And we never managed to get the dashboard implemented. And prototype dashboards don't change the world, as it turns out. And so that didn't really have an impact necessarily. We also had projects where we used open company ownership data. So that's data about who owns the company, where are they based. And we tried to use this data to understand how complex real-world company structures are being used to support corruption, so money laundering and so on and so forth. And we ended up discovering a few leads for actual corruption. But the data quality for open data is so poor that we couldn't actually say this is indeed a corrupt company, or this is a situation that involves corruption. And so while those investigations are ongoing, what we really ended up with was a case study for the importance of this open company ownership data. And our government is using that case study to present to other governments, both to demonstrate why you should open data, but also why you should keep your company ownership data clean and have better quality. And so while this may change the data world, having more data or cleaner data doesn't necessarily change the world on its own. Finally, we've had these projects where we set out to use a variety of sources of data. And what we wanted to do was to discover local communities in need of a third sector service. So for example, for need for child hospice care or other NGO, charity, or government services. And these projects have been a little bit more successful. So this is an example of a project where we worked with Shooting Star Chase, a charity that provides child's hospice service, to identify children who had life-limiting conditions but were dying outside of hospice care. And we ended up identifying 3,500 children. 3,500 children who our partner could seek out and provide that care for. And 3,500 would be a great number, but if 20 or 10 or even a single child who had a life-limiting condition, who wasn't going to be in hospice care, ends up in hospice care, I think that's a sort of better world. And really it's these types of outcomes that we should strive for. We should strive to have an impact on people's lives. We should really strive to use people as our unit for good as we measure success by our own professional standards. The second insight is to work with, not for, because the value of data isn't inherent in data itself. It doesn't come from the insights we discover or the opportunities we recommend. It comes from people changing their actions as a result of these insights and realizing the benefit as a result. Really, it comes from people who are already having actions in the area of good that you're interested in. And so we're sort of lucky that many of us live in these societies where we already have these social actors, where we already have organizations who are actively trying to make the world a better place. And here's a sort of handful of logos for organizations that we've worked with on our Data for Good projects over the last few years. So working with, not for, really means seeking out and partnering with these organizations. It means not being afraid to pursue real-world impact by focusing on your common interests with these organizations. And most importantly, it means bringing others along with you, bringing other non-data people along with you. Now, unfortunately, a good prose with a potentially great impact, it does not make a good project. There are a whole host of other factors. For example, to have a real-world impact, we need data about real-world problems. It can be big, it can be small, as long as you can legally and ethically get your hands on it. And while we're using society's data, we need to be extra careful to protect their privacy, to protect people's rights to go unobserved. Because if data is the new oil, then privacy is the new climate change. We know we need to talk about it. We don't really know what to talk about, but we know that whatever we talk about, the consequences are going to be severe. You also need a clearly stated, well-framed, real-world problem. Now that's often more difficult than actually solving the problem with the data itself. And so we would often spend days or even weeks simply to structure the problem, and that time spent at the beginning of the project goes a long way to help implementation down the line. Finally, because the most important thing is to bring others along with us, simplicity in our solutions is actually our greatest non-negotiable. We need to have solutions which are complex enough to suffice for purpose so that they solve the problem, but they have to be simple enough to be understood by the social actors who are responsible for implementation. And so really it's all of these ingredients combined that make for this ideal data for good project. But of course, each one of these factors on its own is actually very difficult to find. And so if before doing any projects, we had to have all of these things, then we wouldn't really have a data for good movement. We'd have more of a data for good parking lot because none of our ideas would make it past the ideas phase. And so we have all of these factors, but we don't really have all the answers. for how to do a data for good practice, or how to do a good data for good project in practice. And so what I'd like to do is end here by saying that while we don't have all the answers, I think we have some of the questions. And what I'd like to do is keep a conversation open on Twitter, on email, in person. And that conversation is really about how can we as a community form practice around data for good in a way that impacts people's lives, because that's the sort of unit of good we want to strive for. And I believe it's actually us who have to come together as custodians of this movement to create the environment for others to participate, where anybody who has the skills and wants to participate in data for good can. And whether we're sharing our code or sharing our relationships, I believe that if we come together to create that environment, we can actually use data to build a better world. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to speaking with you throughout the conference.